Hello everyone. In this short video, I'm going to talk about series about non-profit organizations. So basically, from an economic standpoint, we are going to understand why nonprofits exist, how do they change, and what are the impacts of nonprofit organizations. And here, summarize it in a table. I think that's clearly describes how we're going to analyze these questions. So the basic questions are why, how, and so what, right? So, but you can divide it into three different levels: on the organizational level, on the industry level, and the whole economy. So I'm going to break it down into three major themes of series that we want to explore that are associated with nonprofit organizations. So the first one we are going to talk about is the social capital theory, and the second one the economics and political theory, and finally the stakeholder theory. So let's look at the social capital approach. Most of you are familiar with Tocqueville's democracy in America, right? So basically it means that voluntary associations is the foundation for democratic governance. And Robert Putnam, in his famous work, Making Democracy Work, also emphasizes the civic tradition, right? So how social capital and how people organize and self-governance is critical to a functioning democracy. So second, we are going to talk about economic and political theory. So basically, we are talking about two different types of failures, right? So why nonprofit exists? Because market is not functioning, market fails, and government fails. So let's briefly talk about what do we mean by market failure. Market failure basically means business feels that in that specific area, doing business won't be profitable, right? So, for instance, the demand is quite heterogeneous, and then only a small amount of money demand that people demand that kind of service. But to profit, you need a certain business scale to be able to make money. But this won't be the case. Now, the other thing related to market failure is about externality and public goods, right? So we'll explain in detail later, but just to speak that because of the externality, markets is not always a very effective way to exclude other consumers like they would do to private goods. So market fails or are not being effective in terms of dealing with public goods. And unfortunately, most of the areas, the goods nonprofit or the service nonprofits are offering public goods and services. So people might wonder, why not then, just government take it over? Now, the other thing is, again, government officers may also think about their own interests. One of the interests is being re-elected, right? So they need a certain voting base. So if they spend a lot of tax dollars on a small amount of people, and which may or may not be their voting base, right? So if we think government or politicians, they are a rational person, and they also facing the demand heterogeneity issue, and they were very reluctant to invest in those areas, that won't be their voting base. And the other thing is, we all know, without proper regulation, government may involve in higher level of corruption. So in these cases, government also fails to provide these goods and services. So if market fails and government fails, then leaves room for nonprofit organizations. So we talked about public goods, right? So what do we really mean by public goods? Public goods means you can't exclude people, and there's no rival goods, not competitors, right? So if we say, okay, one good is excludable and it's a rival, which means I consume, you can't consume, and like food, right? So these will be pure private goods. Now, if it somehow that it's a rival, right, in only a limited amount of people can consume or use it, while it's very hard to exclude people, then you have common pool goods, like fresh air and fishing, or but that usually results without certain regulation, as Harding argued, right? So that will soon result in tragedy of commerce. And if somehow these goods you can exclude some other people, right, by charging people certain fees or selling tickets, etc., right? But they are non-rival, right, which means everybody can use it or visit it as long as they can pay for the tickets. And the common example will be a museum. Then you have the excludable but non-rival goods. And finally, if the goods are non-rival and non-excludable, then that's pure public goods, right? National defense, etc. Okay. So to summarize, basically for public goods series, we are talking about the demand heterogeneous and median voters. So this is related to government failure. And to summarize, okay, so if the goods are private goods, then usually we tend to let the market do its job, okay, because market is more effective in providing private goods, right? And usually this is not a good idea to let government do it, because government gonna fail, right? So nonprofit organizations, they are contested. And for the quasi-public goods, right, which means either you have non-excludable but rival, like museums, right? Market may be functioning at a certain level, but it's better to let nonprofit organizations take care of it, right? And maybe sometimes like libraries, at a certain amount of time you can't let all the people in, but you can let people queue in the line, etc., right? So government can also do that, but in general, we would suggest nonprofits are more effective in providing quasi-public goods. Well, finally, for pure public goods, as we talked about, right, national defense, for example, it's better, in general, it's better to let the government provide it, right? Why market can't do it? Because of market failure. Why nonprofit can't do it? Because of voluntary failure or nonprofit weakness. We are going to talk about nonprofit weakness later. So finally, I'm going to introduce you the stakeholder theory. So the stakeholder series mainly means that all the interested parties on both the demand side and the supply side as stakeholders. All right, so they together have a say in the provision of trust-related goods. Why this is somehow important, right? Because on the demand side, generally when inadequate public goods provision stems not from economic infeasibility, but from mix or government failure, right? So nonprofit organizations can correct these failures. And from the supply side, supply not through the benevolence of nonprofit entrepreneurs or managers, but through demand side stakeholder control, right? Like you have the consumers or clients, donors, and sponsors. And what do we mean by trust related? Right? So trust related is important because nonprofit has a distinguished feature as compared to business and government, right? Even under the information asymmetry condition, because of the non-distribution of profits constraint facing nonprofit organizations, they are usually enjoy a higher level of public trust, especially as compared to public trust in government. Finally, the other thing is talking about the entrepreneurship series. So one of the things emerged recently in nonprofit area, or rather, not say recently, but relatively new. So it's called social enterprise. And social enterprise can be a business or can be a nonprofit, right? So if it's in a nonprofit field, we usually relate it to destructive innovation because it's used very innovative entrepreneurial idea to provide social goods that are usually provided by traditional nonprofits. All right, so summarize, we have three different failings. So market failure and government failure, we already talked about, right? That left space for nonprofit organizations. But nonprofit also faces its own failure, or called voluntary failure. That refers to the situations that nonprofits can't adequately provide a service, right? Or resulted from the inability of nonprofits, right? And let's break it down by what we mean by nonprofit. I label them as nonprofit weakness because I don't really think these are failings. So the first thing is we call insufficiency, because they don't always have the resources, especially the money, to meet the service demand. Okay. Now the other thing is called particularism, because generally nonprofits tend to focus on a particular issue, right? Even though this is for a good social cause, but they may focus on particular issues, and they tend to focus on those visible issues to attract resources, right? Then forego those important, critical, but not that visible issues. All right, so that will create an inequality gap, right? So certain population won't be covered. And the other thing, we call this as paternalism, right? Because most influential, powerful individuals control the charitable resources and determine activities of the sector. Now, they've been many criticized for those big foundations, right? So one of the example facing critique is Bill and the Melinda Gates Foundation, right? Because this is a huge body, and they are even richer than some of the small countries in the international development world. They are being criticized for determining the direction of development, right? Rather than it's a very democratic way by listening to all the stakeholders' opinions. And finally, we call this nonprofit amateurism, right? Non-professionalization, etc., right? So because many of the nonprofit organizations, they use like volunteers, right? So volunteers usually are not specialized in one. They are not particularly have those professional trainings or the skills that are necessary related to the service that nonprofits are providing, right? So even though nonprofit organizations tend to toward professionalization in recent years, but still this is a huge weakness for nonprofit organizations.